can't have capitalist democracy. And the people who really sort of believe in markets, or at least pretend to understand that. So if you read Milton Friedman and other apostles of so-called libertarianism, they don't call for democracy. They call for what they call freedom, which is a very restrictive concept of freedom. It's not the freedom of a working person to control their work, their lives, and so on. It's their freedom to submit themselves to control by a higher authority. That's called freedom, but not democracy. They don't like democracy, and they're right. Capitalism and democracy really are inconsistent. Actually, what's called libertarianism in the United States is about as extreme an example of anti-libertarianism that you can imagine. They're in favor of private tyranny, the worst kind of tyranny by unaccountable private concentrations of wealth. It's worth bearing in mind how radically opposed this is to classical liberalism. Now, they like to invoke, say, Adam Smith, but if you read Adam Smith, he said the opposite. He's famous for not, the claim is that he was opposed to regulation, government regulation, interference in markets. It's not true. He was in favor of regulation, as he put it, when it benefits the working man. He was against interference when it benefited the masters. That's traditional classical liberalism. This, what's called libertarian in the United States, which likes to invoke the history that they've concocted, is radically opposed to basic classical libertarian principles. And it's kind of astonishing to me that a lot of young people, say college students, are attracted by this kind of thing. I mean, you can, after all, read the classical texts. So take, say, Adam Smith. He was considered to be a dangerous radical at the time because he was pretty anti-capitalist. It's sort of pre-capitalist era, but he was opposed to it. He condemned what he called the vile maxim of the masters of mankind, all for ourselves and nothing for anyone else. It's an abomination.
Welcome back to the Millennial-Review, the podcast where we analyze the current political, cultural, and social crises we face from the perspective of the most indebted and disenfranchised generation in history. I'm Justin Ackerman, here by myself for the second installment of our What is Socialism series. If you haven't listened to Trevor's What is Socialism Part 1, you need to go listen to that. It is excellent background and an excellent overview of the historic development of socialism in a broad sense. So again, go listen to it if you haven't, because I listened to it 3 or 4 times preparing this episode, and I think they're best taken as a pair, even though there are probably more installments to come as this discussion that is the What is Socialism episodes builds between episodes. I think it's important to sort of start from the beginning. So if you haven't, go listen to Trevor's What is Socialism. It's really great. It's really high level content, and I think even if you have the faintest idea of what socialism is, or you're a pretty hardcore lefty, it's worth your listen. If for whatever reason you don't listen to me though, and you don't go listen to Trevor's What is Socialism episode, I'm going to provide a brief overview in a second. But first, I just want to ask anyone and everyone who likes our content, who wants to support what we do, join us on Patreon at patreon.com/Millennial-Review. Your support is what makes these What is Socialism explainers possible. It's what makes our historical content possible. It's what makes our political analysis possible. It's what makes all of this possible. And we're trying to build a leftist media platform that speaks for the millennial generation, that speaks to the real disenchantment most millennials feel with the system we live in today. And I think we do a pretty good job at it, but your support is what makes it all possible. We're constantly flattered and humbled, and genuinely we mean that. It's kind of crazy to both of us to think that this whole thing started as just some memes and us talking and became what it is today. again, we're flattered, but we'd like to see how far we can go with it, how big we can make it, and what we can do together. So if you're interested in seeing how far it can go as well, join us on Patreon at patreon.com/Millennial-Review. Come join us on Discord, where we have active political discussion every day. And again, it helps everything we do, from memes to articles to podcasts. So join us on Patreon at patreon.com/Millennial-Review. So I'm going to start my episode on what is socialism with a overview of Trevor's episode, because again, I think it's a really great broad overview of the broad sweep of leftist thought, and it really provides a really good framework for how I want to sort of build my conception of socialism on top of that framework that I think for the most part Trevor and I share anyway. It's just, making sure that everyone else who listens to this part 2 has all of the pieces from part 1 necessary to really make sense of what I'm talking about. I could spend a lot of time adding additional historic and political context, and I will do that in this episode, but I think more than that, what is socialism is something that's currently up for grabs. There is a current debate happening within leftist circles on what is socialism, what it means to organize and push for socialism, and what your end goal is. And I think Trevor and I have different conceptions of what that looks like. We have different conceptions of what appropriate organizing looks like and how you push for that goal. In a broad sense, obviously we agree on most things, on a lot, and we see the world far more similarly than we see the world with liberals or conservatives. And we see the world in a way that's closer to other leftists than liberals and conservatives for the most part, even though we have broad differences in the way we see the world. And especially given the relative youth and lack of strength within leftist politics in the United States right now, I think it's really important to just be forgiving of people that have different conceptions of these ideas than you do. And I think more than that, it's important to keep in mind that the question, what is socialism, is inherently complicated. It's inherently contested, and it's just like asking, what is Christianity? What does it mean to be human? Any of these big ideological, moral questions, and what is socialism, I think, is one of those sorts of questions. And so when it comes to the nitty-gritty details, I think Trevor and I diverge quite a bit in some areas. When it comes to the broad thrust of what we want to see, what we want the United States to look like, and what we think we should do in the short term to achieve those goals, I think we obviously see a lot in common. And I think one big thing we have in common is just the general sense in how socialism developed, how capitalism developed, and how these sorts of systems are created in the first place. And I must stress, go listen to Trevor's episode if you haven't, but just as a broad overview, he sort of covers the path out of feudalism, how we get to sort of early market sort of societies, from how, specifically how peasants and sort of the landed class accumulate wealth, move to the cities. It sort of fundamentally reshapes the economy. And then this is sort of naturalized, and you have the sort of secularization of society, this sort of the beginning of markets as we know them. And as society grows, employment, industrialization, and the sort of need to sell your labor become more prominent parts of the economy. And this discussion that this isn't something that happens naturally, this is a man-made system, that this wasn't just always the case, that feudal society was structured very differently and we didn't have to sort of have the development that we had, is a really important one. And again, go listen to Trevor's episode, go listen to the Creating Capitalist Society episode from the past, because that idea is very important, that this market sort of system that we find ourselves in today, the sort of early beginnings of capitalism, that was intentionally created, but also sort of given a mystic glow in history that sort of gives it this role that we've always had, like we've always had some sort of market mechanism in society that just like really isn't the case. But as that society grows, as the need for employment grows, income surplus value, the labor theory of value, and, this idea that Trevor discusses that when you look at companies like McDonald's, the burger flippers are the people who actually build those companies, who actually built those companies. But those burger flippers who built those companies are inherently subordinated under capitalism. They're inherently under the boss, and the extra value that their labor contributes to that enterprise is is what keeps it going, but is also you have to extract. That is the fuel that runs the capitalist economy, is the workers' excess labor. And this is sort of the fundamental contradiction that Marx describes, that Trevor talked about in his first episode, and the goal of socialist systems is to overcome that fundamental contradiction. And from there, Trevor goes on to describe the three broad camps of socialism and sort of three big boxes you can put most socialist thought in. That being Nordic-style social democracy, planned economies or state socialism, and democratic socialism. And this is the really important piece of the discussion I think we need for what I want to add to the what is socialism conversation, is these three camps: the social democracy, the state socialism, and the democratic socialism. These three camps, how they interact and how you use them in different sectors of the economy in different ways to build a policy framework that sort of enacts a socialist economy that creates a world where workers and average people are not subordinate to those with wealth and the benefits that flow from other positions of power within hierarchies that shouldn't exist. And so throughout this discussion, that's something I think we should keep in mind, that in my mind, this sort of socialist, anti-capitalist project is also inherently an intersectional one, and one where you have to appreciate the ways in which race, gender, and other marginalized classes, sort of the way that marginalization manifests in the economy and the way the economy reinforces that marginalization. Those things are intertwined, and to me, it goes without saying that if you're going to deconstruct capitalism, you also have to deconstruct the way capitalism takes advantage of white supremacy, the way it takes advantage of sexism, the way it takes advantage of transphobia to keep people of color, to keep women, to keep gender non-conforming and trans people in subordinate positions within the economy, and use economic power to sort of enshrine the biases that hold people down to begin with. So that is the broad framing, that there are these broad sets of tools we can use. Social democracy, which is sort of a reformist philosophy that aims to change the system we live in big ways and sort of anticipate fundamental structural changes into the future. We can use state socialism, the kind that we've seen throughout history, this sort of centrally planned, state-owned enterprise sort of socialism, the kind that we see used to varying degrees of success throughout Europe. There's a lot of state-owned enterprise in Norway and Finland, for example. You could use the post office as an example, even though it's kind of silly and cliche. And then to me, where my conception really lies, where the bulk of what I and my socialist project and what socialism means to me sits in, is the democratic socialist tradition. Meaning we use the ballot box, we use democratic organizing, and I don't just mean voting and taking your friends to the voting booth. I mean Kingian nonviolence. I mean selective sort of civil disruption aimed at bringing in socialism using these mechanisms that aren't violent overthrow of the state. In a broad sense, the goal of that democratic socialism, in my mind, are encapsulated in a few really well-known Marx quotes, specifically from his critique of the Gotha program, in which this is something many of you are probably familiar with, the sort of broad idea of from each according to their ability, to each according to their need. And it's really simple. From each according to their ability, what you're able to give to society, we want you to contribute to society. To each according to their need. Society will provide you with everything you need. In my mind, that is the goal of a socialist economy, is to provide a baseline standard of living, a baseline level of opportunity, and a just social safety net and structures of social solidarity that make life worth living, that make a fruitful life possible, or at least eminently plausible for everybody, no matter who you are, no matter where you're born or who you're born to. And in my mind, that was the promise of the capitalist economy, but socialism is the attempt to fix the problems that prevented that promise from ever coming to fruition. And so in addition to this from each according to their ability, to each according to their need, I think also just the vague idea of the workers owning the means of production, but I think to me more specifically, people owning the means of production, people owning the enterprise they take part in, and it doesn't necessarily have to be work. It could be the community you find yourself a part of, the neighborhood you find yourself a part of. And as we get into my conception of socialism, I think that will start to make more sense. But again, I think the broad goal of socialist change in my mind is these sort of broad ideas of from each according to their ability, to each according to their need, and workers or just average people owning and controlling the means of production. And again, this is really broad. This is sort of high school history class marks, but I think keep those two overarching goals in mind as I get more specific and sort of dive into what socialism means to me and what a socialist economy in the United States looks like, or at least just a socialist economy, what that would look like in my opinion. So with those broad goals in mind, we also have to answer a question Trevor posed in his episode and a question that was posed long before him by Rosa Luxemburg, whether or not the changes we are offering are reforms or revolutionary change. And in my mind, those broader goals are inherently tied up in the question of reform or revolution, and you can't answer them, or at least truly answer them, without answering that reform or revolution question with the latter. In my mind, the question posed by Luxemburg was rhetorical. The answer, revolution, is necessary because reform simply allows the vestiges of the old system to work itself back into society and back into people's lives. The examples Trevor used in his podcast of the Black experience in the United States post-Civil War through the 1920s or so, and the respective industrialization processes of Russia and China are informative. These were all massive changes. The American Civil War, the Bolshevik Revolution, the Chinese Revolution of 1949, these were all revolutionary events in their own right, but as Trevor explained, none of them really truly did away with the systems they overthrew. They all allowed for the implementation of the racist Jim Crow system, the sharecropping system that subordinated Black people and took advantage of their labor while maintaining that subordination through a proto-fascist KKK and other political organizations of the like. You have, a sort of peasant class forced into an industrial role in both Russia and China without really breaking the sort of bonds and the social structures that subordinated peasants to begin with. And again, taking the Civil War, and we could have a whole podcast or a whole series on Reconstruction and what went wrong, but when Trevor talks about the giddy excitement many Black writers wrote about upon emancipation, only to find sharecropping and Jim Crow and other institutions designed to recreate a disguised version of the racist society which enabled and justified slavery to begin with, that is the dynamic we're talking about when we talk about revolution or reform. Are you creating a system that will allow Jim Crow to exist and reconstruct some of these racist structures that enabled slavery to begin with? And even though we've deconstructed many of those systems, many of them continue to persist through things like mass incarceration and the institutionalization of intergenerational poverty, which is intentionally created through policies like redlining. I could go on, but the point is that to really solve these problems, instead of just playing whack-a-mole with new manifestations of oppressive systems, you need revolutionary change. With whatever system or structure of society you're dealing with, you have to fundamentally change it in a structural or systemic way if you're going to sort of root out the oppression it creates. So what does that mean? What do these big structural and systemic changes look like in an American socialist economy? Well, that obviously looks different in different sectors of the economy, sort of changes we can make to the market economy broadly that I think will create the revolutionary systemic and structural changes necessary to bring us out of the category of reform and will really allow for a fundamental reworking that doesn't just allow the previous system to work itself back in a new or disguised fashion decades down the line. But in my mind, the first step to enacting any policy of that sort and to creating the world that we want to see is fundamentally reworking the concept of private property and the role it plays in American society and the American economy. economy. Because if we're going to work towards ideals like from each according to their ability, to each according to their need, or the workers owning the means of production, we have to change the way we view private property, because if we don't, that concept, the sort of role private property plays right now, will kill any sort of redistributive action needed to sort of create the system we need to usher in the revolutionary change that won't allow a sort of oppressive economy to work itself over the reforms we are able to bring in the short term. There's a Rousseau quote from The Social Contract and the Discourses I like that I think encapsulates the move to private property and its consequences. He says, quote, "The first person who, having enclosed a plot of land, took to his head to say, 'This is mine,' and found the people simple enough to believe him, was the true founder of civil society. What crimes, wars, murders, and miseries, and horrors would the human race have been spared, had some pulled up the stakes or filled in the ditch and cried to their fellow man, 'Do not listen to this impostor. You are lost if you forget that the fruits of the earth belong to all and the earth to no one.'" End quote. And this was written at sort of that early market period Trevor talks about that I think is so important for the sort of development of capitalism and the potential move to socialism. And in a lot of ways, I think that quote encapsulates the whole evolution of the concept of private property and the problems therein. But specifically for our purposes, it's just important to highlight that these are active choices that we make. Private property is a human construct. Despite what the founding fathers might have had you believe, it's not a God-given right, even though they obviously had enormous monetary stake to make people believe it was. Private property is an active political decision we've made and continue to make that has disastrous human consequences. Private property, the profit motive, and sort of this desire to accumulate is hugely problematic. And I'm going to go on a bit of a tangent here, but I think it's an important one because in the American political context, property ownership is so woven into the political framework and has been since the beginning of the country, it's hard to imagine anything different. The founders were so hopped up on John Locke that we've been forced to live with the consequences. It's made doubly worse because the American political thinkers on both sides of the ideological spectrum, and I mean the ideological spectrum at the founding, so that's very limited, but those people were so tied to a Lockean conception of property rights that this sort of Lockean conception of property is the very foundation of freedom and democracy as most people in America know it. And early founders, but specifically Thomas Jefferson, sort of have this sense that there is so much land in the United States that everyone will get their own little slice, and that is how we will have freedom. And if you read de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, there was this sense that there was so much land available that freedom was possible in a way that it just simply wasn't in Europe. That, coupled with the fact that there wasn't a landed aristocracy that controlled basically everything in a sort of hereditary way, the same way there was in Europe. And then there was just so much Native American land to pillage that people could live free in a way that simply wasn't possible in Europe. That's like a rough paragraph version of some de Tocqueville, but I think this idea that land is tied to freedom and that there is so much of it in the United States that isn't really something you have to question. This fundamental role that private property plays with the American conception of freedom isn't something that really comes to a head for a while because there's just a lot of Native American land to pillage and a lot of empty land to the west that people are able to settle for decades, centuries. And this sort of Lockean conception of property is fundamental to freedom and baked into the American political system. But when Locke is writing his treatises on civil government, this was sort of the beginning of this creation of capitalist society that Trevor talks about, that we've talked about in previous episodes, that's just fundamental to this sort of transition to markets and capitalism. This move from feudalism to early markets, Locke's there writing at that time, and he sort of leans into that change, and the American founders really ran with it. I mean, these are hugely debated texts, but I sort of see Locke as an advocate and a mouthpiece for this broader social and cultural change that the world is sort of going through. He didn't inspire this change, though in the American context, I think he articulated it in a way that the founders really ran with. And if you read Locke himself, you can see, I think, why his conception of private property has had such an enduring impact on the United States. And so this is from Locke's second treatise on civil government, from chapter 5 on property. He writes, quote, "God, who has given the world to men in common, has also given them reason to make use of it to the best advantage of life and convenience. The earth and everything in it is given to men for the support and comfort of their existence. All the fruits it naturally produces and animals that it feeds, as produced by the spontaneous hand of nature, belong to mankind in common. Nobody has a basic right, a private right, that excludes the rest of mankind over any of them as they are in their natural state. But they were given for the use of men, and before they can be useful or beneficial to any particular man, there must be some way for a particular man to appropriate them. The wild Indians in North America don't have fences or boundaries and are still joint tenants of their territory, but if any one of them is to get any benefit from fruit or venison, the food in question must be his, and his in such a way that no one else retains a right to it. Though men as a whole own the earth and all inferior creatures, every individual man has property in his own person. This is something that nobody else has any right to. The labor of his body and the work of his hands, we may say, are strictly his. So when he takes something from the state that nature has provided and left it in, he mixes his labor with it, thus joining to it something that is his own, and in that way he makes it his property. He has removed the item from the common state that nature has placed it in, and through this labor the item has been annexed to it something that excludes the common right of other men, for this labor is unquestionably the property of the laborer, so no other man can have a right to anything the labor is enjoined to, at least where there is enough and as good left in common for others." End quote. And so basically, stuff is there in the common, and like Rousseau said, someone comes along and says, this is my stuff. And in Locke's mind, the effort it took to say that it was your stuff, to harvest that stuff, to fence it off, to collect it, to do what you had to do to say this is mine, that effort is what actually makes it yours, removes it from the commons, and it becomes your property. And again, in the United States, I think you can see how this is a pretty compelling conception of property, especially to the colonists and especially to the founding fathers, who have a huge stake in sort of expanding the United States and taking more and more land and sort of directly disobeying the king, who was saying, don't move west, quit encroaching on Native American lands. They said the exact opposite. They said, fuck that. There is so much land there for the taking. And this sort of Lockean conception of property rights sort of enshrines that, and it provides the academic justification the founders needed to sort of run with this budding market conception, this budding system of private property, and solidify their place on top of it in the, quote, new world. But there was a caveat there. At the end of that, Locke said, quote, "For this labor is unquestionably the property of the laborer, so no other man can have a right to anything that labor is enjoined to, at least where there is enough and as good left in common for others." End quote. And so to me, that's where Marx comes in. I think Marx would agree that the labor used to obtain property has value. I think he would probably say that that is sort of the base of his labor theory of value, that value added is being extracted by the capital class once you have a complex enough system of industrialization to allow that extraction on a mass scale. But Locke was writing at a time before the Industrial Revolution. This idea, and that's why I think it's so attractive in the American context, this idea that there will always be enough and as good for others that you may take from the land, and that private property is okay because there will be enough to distribute. In the American context, when Locke was writing, when the founders found that idea compelling, that's a very different sort of idea than when Marx sort of takes this conception of private property. And so Marx, he's the response to the fact that capitalism is unable to leave enough and as good for everyone else. The system is just structurally incapable of it. And that is what Marx is responding to. It creates a system where people just continually accumulate, continually expand at the expense of others, and it leaves neither enough nor what is left is as good. And it's fundamentally contradictory. And that's something we talk about a lot. And it has disastrous human consequences. And so when we talk about the fundamental contradiction of capitalism, I mean, there's a lot of instances that you could point to, but in a broad way, when we talk about it, a lot of the contradictions in capitalism that Marx's entire body of work aims to point out, I think at its root is just this system that is built on the accumulation of material goods and profit, and this sort of Lockean ideal of only taking enough and is good. That's just not possible. And that's the contradiction, is that you have to keep taking, and that inherently means that there won't be enough and it won't be as good, especially because in a broad sense, the system forces everybody to prioritize their own accumulation at the expense of the accumulation of others. And we'll come back to Marx because I think Engels speaks to it specifically also in his Conditions of the Working Class in England in 1844, but more specifically for our purposes, the unique dynamics of budding industrial capitalism in the United States in his 1896 appendix to that 1844 essay, Conditions on the Working Class in England. He writes, and this is about the United States, quote, "There were two circumstances which for a long time prevented the unavoidable consequences of the capitalist system from showing themselves in the full glare of day in America. These were the easy access to ownership of cheap land and the influx of immigration. They allowed for many years the great mass of Native American population," and he means white people, "to retire in early manhood from wage labor and to become farmers, dealers, or employers of labor, while the hard work for wages, the position of proletarian for life, was mostly left to the lot of immigrants. But America has outgrown this early stage. The boundless backwoods have disappeared, and the still more boundless prairies are fast and faster passing from the hands of the nation and the states into those of private owners. The great safety valve against the formation of a permanent proletarian class has practically ceased to act. A class of lifelong and even hereditary proletarians exists at this hour in America, a nation of 60 millions striving hard to become, and with every chance of success too, the leading manufacturing nation of the world. Such a nation cannot permanently import its own wage-working class, not even if immigrants pour in at the rate of 500,000 a year. The tendency of the capitalist system towards the ultimate splitting up of society into two classes, a few millionaires on one hand and a great mass of mere wage workers on the other, this tendency, though constantly crossed and counteracted by other social agencies, works nowhere with greater force than in America, and the result has been the production of a class of Native American wage workers, again by Native American he means white people, who form indeed the aristocracy of the wage working class as compared with the immigrants, but who become conscious more and more every day of their solidarity with the latter, and who feel all the more acutely their present condemnation to lifelong wage toil, because they still remember the bygone days when it was comparatively easy to rise to a higher social level. Accordingly, the working class movement in America has started with truly American vigor, and as on that side of the Atlantic things march with at least double the European speed, we may yet live to see America take the lead in this respect too." End quote. All right, so that's a lot to unpack, but I think the big thing there is the dynamic that capitalism needs to produce. It needs to produce. It needs to produce. And in the United States, originally in an agrarian context, that just means westward expansion. That means the genocide of native populations to take their land for agrarian uses. That means the enslavement of black people for the agrarian southern economy. But capitalism was still producing. The market and industrial economies as we know them simply hadn't developed. But as Engels describes, by the 1890s, not most of California, but the big Californian cities are sort of thriving already. The West Coast is beginning to be populated. The railroads have connected the country, and not just like coast to coast. That happened in 1869, but you have big regional cities start to develop. I'm in one now, Spokane, Washington. If you go downtown in Spokane, Washington right now, almost all of the buildings are turn of the 20th century, late 1890s construction, And this is sort of this massive expansion. And this is what Engels is talking about, because the easy part of this westward expansion, of this produce part of American capitalism has ended. And now he describes the influx of immigrants to try and keep up the sort of heightened productive capacity that American industries develop. And Engels writes about the sort of bifurcation of the working class into what he calls the native wage workers, which he means white, sort of waspy Americans, and the immigrants. And you know, in the 1890s, over 9 million people immigrated to the United States. 3 million of them came from the UK. I would guess that they're probably lumped in with this native wage worker group in Engels' writing. 3.9 million people came from Northern Europe, which includes the United Kingdom, Scandinavia, Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, Sweden. 3.9 million people coming from those countries. You have 3.3 million people coming from Western Europe, which includes Belgium, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Austria, France, Germany, Switzerland. And then this is the immigration that he's really talking about, that he sees as sort of bifurcating into two classes of wage workers: the 216,000 immigrants coming from Southern Europe, the 512,000 coming from Eastern Europe. And that's just in the 1890s. More importantly, those numbers were just sort of on the low end. In the 1920s, you have an influx of Eastern European immigration. 3.7 million Eastern European immigrants come in the 1920s. A similar number come in the 1910s. So that's just to sort of highlight the makeup of the sort of immigrant population Engels sees as splitting into these two separate classes. I think that obviously is relevant to the United States context today. Though the ethnic divides have changed significantly, then it was more of a Southern and Eastern European versus Western Northern European divide. Just for example, in 1890, there were 90,000 immigrants from Latin America and 69,000 from Central America. Compare that again to the Southern European figure of 200,000 and the Eastern European figure of 516,000, or the Northern European of 4 million. So you see how that sort of adds up. That's the bifurcation of the working class at that time. And I highlight that to say Engels is sort of writing about how he sees this immigrant group, this immigrant population, and how the capitalists are sort of playing them off of each other, but then also says, quote, "The tendency of the capitalist system towards the ultimate splitting up of society into two classes, a few millionaires on one hand and a great mass of mere wage workers on the other, this tendency, though constantly crossed and counteracted by other social agencies, works nowhere with greater force than in America, and the result has been the production of a class of Native American wage workers, who form indeed the aristocracy of the wage working class as compared with immigrants, but who become conscious more and more every day of their solidarity with the latter, and who feel all the more acutely their present condemnation to lifelong wage toil, because they still remember the bygone days when it was comparatively easy to rise to a higher social level." And I want to say that today, in the American context, it's easy to take that quote and see the breaking up of American society into two classes, a few millionaires on one hand and a great mass of mere wage workers on the other, as Engels says. That's obvious if you look around in the United States today. But when you hear him talk about this budding solidarity between the native aristocracy and the immigrant wage workers, that seems harder to replicate in the American context. But I want to say he's writing this at 1896, and that was not, the Southern and Eastern European divide was not what it is today. Italian people and Irish people and all sorts of different ethnic groups from Europe were not considered white as they are today. These were fierce ethnic and religious divides that are really hard to grasp in the modern context. The sort of Catholic Protestant divide is still with us today, obviously. It's not like it was then. These were really heated, centuries-long ethnic divisions, and they were sort of plastered over into the American context. And when you look at the success of the labor movement over the next 20 years, when Engels wrote that in 1896, I think on some hand he was right when he said that the American labor movement was going to move with vigor and sort of march forward with the same speed as the industrialization of the United States that had unfolded the decades prior. But it was still an open question. In the late 1890s, the Pope wrote an encyclical telling Catholics to only join Catholic trade unions with a focus on God, not unions, and explicitly condemned socialism. And socialism was sort of budding as an early intersectional movement and a way for immigrants to sort of come together. And Engels saw the potential there, but it was an open question. And in 1910, Eugene Debs wrote on immigration, writing, quote, "My dear Brewer, have just read the majority report of the Committee on Immigration. It is utterly unsocialistic, reactionary, and in truth outrageous. And I hope you will oppose with all your power the plea that certain races are to be excluded because of tactical expediency. It would be entirely consistent in a bourgeois convention of self-seekers, but should have no place in a proletariat gathering under the auspices of an international movement that is calling on the oppressed and exploited workers of all the world to unite for their emancipation. Away with the tactics which require the exclusion of the oppressed and suffering slaves who seek these shores with the hope of bettering their wretched condition and are driven back under the cruel lash of expediency by those who call themselves socialists in the name of a movement whose proud boast it is that it stands uncompromisingly for the oppressed and downtrodden of all the earth. These poor slaves have just as good a right to enter here as even the authors of this report who now seek to exclude them. The only difference is the latter had the advantage of a little education and had not been so cruelly ground and oppressed, but in point of principle there is no difference, the motive of all being precisely the same, and if the convention which meets in the name of socialism should discriminate at all, it should be in favor of the miserable races who have borne the heaviest burdens and are most nearly crushed to death. Upon this vital proposition I would take my stand against the world. The alleged advantages that would come to the socialist movement because of such heartless exclusion would all be swept away 1,000 times by the sacrifice of a cardinal principle of the international socialist movement. For well might the good faith of such a movement be questioned by intelligent workers if it placed itself upon record as barring its doors against the very races most in need of relief and extinguishing their hope and leaving them in dark despair at the very time their ears were first attuned to the international call and their hearts were beginning to throb responsive to the solidarity of the oppressed of all lands and the climes beneath the skies. In this attitude there is nothing of sentimentality, but simply a rigid adherence to the fundamental principles of the international proletarian movement. If socialism, international revolutionary socialism, does not stand staunchly, unflinchingly, and uncompromisingly for the working class and for the exploited and oppressed masses of all lands, then it stands for none, and its claim is a false pretense, and its profession a delusion and a snare. Let us stand squarely on our revolutionary working class principles and make our fight open and uncompromisingly against all our enemies, adopting no cowardly tactics and holding out no false hopes, and our movement will then inspire the faith, arouse the spirit, and develop the fiber that will prevail against the world. Yours without compromise, Eugene V. Debs. End letter. So Debs in 1910 was still grappling with the question Engels posed of whether or not the American working class could sort of break free from the ethnic divides which were keeping it from organizing and keeping it from destroying the divide that Engels talked about of a few millionaires on one hand and the mass of wage workers on the other. And on one hand, it failed. This movement failed Black Americans, though there were Black labor unions and there was an important Black labor presence, especially at the end of World War II. This movement obviously failed Native Americans, but when Debs tied the struggle of international revolutionary socialism to that of immigrants, he was doing so at a time when he was basically actively running for president. And just 2 years later, Debs pulls off one of the best third-party runs in American history under the Socialist Party banner. He receives over 900,000 votes, totaling over 6% of the vote. This was a really radical election, and Debs capitalized on it. So to have him writing that the struggle of international socialism is inherently tied to that of immigrants, to that of the people most exploited by the system, that is an incredibly important voice to have in this discussion. And I think when you look at the fact that he got 6% of the vote running as a socialist, that labor unions are sort of at their peak at this point, or at least they're actively agitating and fighting for changes, and the progressive policy agenda of the day is like fundamentally shaped by labor in some way. Debs is playing an important role, and an intersectional one, and he's helping answer the Engels question of whether or not the United States working class can overcome these immigrant, native-born divides that he described. And on some level, I think you can say they sort of did, obviously with the caveats I've laid out repeatedly. That dynamic of a working class bifurcated along ethnic divides, and then that bifurcation being taken advantage of by a few millionaires on one hand to sort of gain the benefits of the economy at the expense of the massive wage workers on the other, that dynamic seems all too familiar to people today. And even though the election of 1912 was revolutionary in some ways, even though Debs's campaign was revolutionary in some ways, and even though he was pushing a vision that sounds as compelling today as it did then, there's a reason we're still struggling with these questions, and it's because we didn't answer the reform or revolution question with revolution. And fundamentally, to revolutionize our system is to do away with the concept of private property. And not entirely, probably, but we have to fundamentally restructure the role it plays in our economy, because inherently this drive to produce, this drive to accumulate is rooted in private property. It's rooted in this Lockean notion that you can accumulate and still leave enough and as good as for everybody else. And obviously Engels, Debs, and most people with a brain today see that that is not possible. It's simply not working. And Marx, in an 1844 essay titled Private Property and Communism, I think highlights the problem and sort of has a early capitalist realism critique in his writing. Quote, "Private property has made us so stupid and one-sided that an object is only ours when we have it, when it exists for us as capital, or when it is directly possessed, eaten, drunk, worn, inhabited, etc. In short, when it is used by us. Although private property itself conceives all these direct realizations of possession only as means of life, and the life which they serve as means is the life of private property, labor, and conversion into capital." And so he's basically saying that we as humans sort of look at objects, we look at the things around us, and we only see the value that they provide for us in the economy. A good example from our capitalist realism episode is like meditation apps. You have this product that is supposed to help you escape and recharge from your life as a laborer, and it's sold to you as a way to keep laboring. It's sold as a way to escape the stress of the system that forces you to use it. And so it's only useful to you in that context to meditate if it can recharge you, if it can provide you with the ability to be more productive and be a better laborer in the capitalist economy. And so when Marx says we only value property when it's directly possessed, eaten, drunk, and worn, when it's used, and its only means of life, the life of private property, is labor and the conversion into capital, that is what he means. It has made us so dumb that we are only able to deal with property in these economic terms. And in my opinion, and I think Marx's opinion, the root cause of that is sort of this Lockean notion that you can take private property, that you can have this concept of leaving enough and as good for everybody else, and that you can run with that on an economy-wide level, and that it'll work out, because it simply doesn't. And so from there, Marx writes, quote, "The abolition of private property is therefore the complete emancipation of all human senses and qualities, but it is this emancipation precisely because these senses and attributes have become subjectively and objectively human. The eye has become a human eye, just as its object has become a social human object, an object made by man for man." He uses the eye as an example, but I think you can extend it to all private property. We have to create a system where property, the object, is a social human object. As Marx would say, an object made by man for man, as opposed to an object we are only using for the value it provides in the capitalist economy, the capital we can extract from it. And so when Engels and Debs are writing for the hope of the American political working class, when they're debating this question of immigrant labor and, quote, native wage labor, at its core, they pushed politics politics in a meaningful way. But the question of reform or revolution was undoubtedly answered with reform. And again, from the beginning of the episode, reform and revolution is a question of, did you change the system in such a fundamental and structural way that the old system, that the exploitative and oppressive natures of the old system don't work themselves back into the new? And so when Engels writes about an American system which bifurcates immigrant labor, native wage labor, and then empowers millionaires off the back of that bifurcation at the expense of the massive wage laborers, he writes about it with great hope that we can fix it. And Debs seized on that. Debs and other people in the American context did push for meaningful reform, meaningful changes. Some even could be called revolutionary. You have massive union power, you have the end of child labor, you have labor standards for the first time, and the beginnings of what would eventually become the New Deal. And in some sense, this is happening as these sort of disparate ethnic and religious groups in the United States are organizing as labor and not through the frame of those other identities. With shortcomings, of course, but this is a moment where labor really flexed its powers and brought the economy closer to where it needed to be. But it still really wasn't that revolutionary. There were aspects. I would say the creation of free public education in the United States is one, and that goes hand in hand with the abolition of child labor. That is a revolutionary change which has some shortcomings and some downsides, but it did fundamentally reshape society. Although I think there's a compelling case to be made that it did so in a way that benefited industrial society and was just simply a way to train our kids to be good factory workers versus good farmers. I digress, but for the most part, there weren't very many revolutionary changes. There were just really heavy reforms that have been slowly chipped away at in the decades since the New Deal. And with particular ferocity since the Goldwater Revolution into the Reagan years and onward. Through Bill Clinton, through George W. Bush, through Obama, and today, which is why when we read Engels, when we talk about the mass of divided immigrants and native wage workers being exploited to the benefit of millionaires on one hand at the expense of the mass of wage workers, there's a reason that sounds like it could have been written yesterday. It's because we didn't fundamentally revolutionize the way we view private property. We didn't fundamentally disrupt or reorganize the way housing or healthcare is provided throughout these decades, though we did make significant reforms, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. But there's a reason all of these programs, all of these safety nets are still on the chopping block and have been chipped away for decades. It's because we didn't reorganize society in a revolutionary manner that prevents the process of accumulation that Engels described and the sort of dumbing down process that Marx described. We didn't fundamentally rework the way we view private property, so those processes are still at work. And those processes are capital, and you can see the work that those processes have done all around us. The rollback of labor and unions in the American context, the rollback of rent control in the UK, and the recommodification of housing, the lengthy list of Reaganite and Clinton-era neoliberal reforms that we could talk about ad nauseum. On some level, all of these rollbacks are the result of a failure to answer the question of revolution or reform with revolution, and specifically a revolution in the way we conceive of property ownership. And we need to revolutionize the way we conceive of property ownership to a more Marxian frame where we view it for the use it provides to human beings. And that looks different in different sectors of the economy. You have to use different tools from that social democracy, state socialism, or democratic socialism toolkit. Trevor and I have different conceptions of what that looks like, but at its core, that is the task. We have to revolutionize the way we view private property, and until we do that, we haven't really answered the question of revolution or reform correctly. We haven't answered it with revolution. Because before we can tackle any individual issue, whether it's healthcare, housing, the economy in general, or climate change, anything, we have to tackle that fundamental issue of private property, how we view it as a concept, and the role it plays in our economy. On some level, policy prescriptions like Medicare for all, public housing, cooperative housing, workers' co-ops, co-determination, social wealth funds, and other mechanisms that give working people control over their life and provide the goods you need to live a good life free of charge at point of service. These are the sorts of mechanisms which answer that reform or revolution question with the latter. These are the sorts of changes we can make to bring us closer to that sort of Marxist ideal where property isn't just used for the use it gives us in accumulating capital, but instead is put to human uses, is put to the benefit of all of us, and isn't just feeding this system that allows for the accumulation of wealth and capital and power and pits everybody else that doesn't have it against one another to solidify the structures that enable those who have accumulated that wealth and power to accumulate it in the first place. So we have to create something new entirely, which is why those few policies I listed do that in some sense. And that's not to say you have to go that far for a policy to be a useful change or a useful goal for you to push towards. Medicare wasn't necessarily Medicare for all. It wasn't revolutionary in the sense that it just fundamentally transformed the way we deliver healthcare in the country, but it did for older people. And it's the type of social democratic reform that Trevor discusses in his episode that opens the door for truly revolutionary change, that opens the door for Medicare for all, which could be an NHS free at point of service sort of program. We could decommodify healthcare, and Medicare and the budding social democracy you could make a case was coming in the 1960s under LBJ is to thank for that. In a fundamental way, you can't have Medicare for all without Medicare, and it's not just a branding thing. And so the path to revolution and revolutionary change isn't always just blowing up the entire system. Sometimes there is a path through social democracy. Sometimes that won't work. And I think American labor relations are a great example of that. Housing in the UK and in the United States today is another great example of that. We didn't fundamentally change labor power, the structures of labor, and how we organize our economy, and as such, capital was slowly able to chip away at the gains achieved from 1890 to 1960, really, 1968. And ever since, we've seen Ronald Reagan, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Obama, and now Trump just chip away at that progress. And so it looks different in different arenas, and you use different tools to get there in different places, but ultimately, the goal has to be fundamental, revolutionary, structural, and systemic change that doesn't allow the status quo of yesterday to work itself back into the picture once you think you have solved the problem. And I think the first step in that revolutionary change is reorganizing how we think of property, going from the Lockean frame that the founders loved to the Marxist frame that is a direct response to the shortcomings of that Lockean frame. And if you want to help us transition to that Marxist frame of private property, help us accumulate more private property, and join us on Patreon at patreon.com/Millennial-Review. I always feel really bad about plugs at the end of episodes like this, so I feel like I'll just be blatant about what's happening here and hope that you like the content enough to join us anyway. And if you did, follow us on social media at Mill-Review on Twitter, Millennial-Review .org on Instagram, Just Millennial-Review on Facebook and Tumblr. And as always, if you want to support everything we do, from memes to podcasts to articles, join us on Patreon at patreon.com/Millennial-Review.